Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 6th episode of Reappropriate the podcast. I'm really excited to have you guys joining me tonight for a really special conversation about digital activism, wherein me and my guest, Cayden Mak, are going to tackle the question whether or not digital activism is real activism, which is like sort of this hot-button topic that I figured I can go on forever about, and I think other people can go on forever about, and I think it's really relevant to things that are happening this year. So in order to tackle this conversation, I invited, as I said, Cayden Mak, who is with 18 Million Rising, and he tweets at Cayden. And so Cayden, if you want to say hi and introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, totally. Hey, I'm Cayden. Cayden from the internet is sometimes how I'm called.
As opposed to Cayden in real life?
When your Twitter handle is your first name and like you start meeting people at conferences, they're like, "Oh, you must be Cayden, like Cayden." I'm like, "Yeah, that's right." I am the new media director at 18millionrising.org. For those of you who don't know our work, we do racial justice organizing online, Asian American community, and that looks a lot of different ways. We do internet petitions, we do Twitter chats. Sometimes I live stream direct action. We make videos, we host Google Hangout chats, we collaborate with literally hundreds of partners across the country to really like sort of elevate the conversation about what racial justice means for the Asian American community. And I've been with 18MR since we started in September of 2012. We're coming up in a couple days actually on our 2-year anniversary, which is really exciting. And,
congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah, we're still going. Somehow we still exist, which is thrilling.
No, I don't think that's a somehow thing. So I invited Cayden on because I actually think that 18 Million Rising is like the superstars or rock stars of the AAPI blogosphere in terms of really trying to do translational. So as a scientist, we have this thing called translational medicine, which is taking the ideas that you do in science and turning it into therapies. And I kind of think of 18 Million Rising in the same way, but for social justice, it's translational because it takes the ideas that we build online and it turns it into real action through various digital tools. So I always like to talk to 18 Million Rising and support what you guys do because I feel like you guys are really doing that sort of communicating work that's sort of taking what we're doing online and making it into something.
Well, I'm fucking psyched to hear that because that's what we want to be.
That's awesome. And actually, part of the so I hope that Cayden, I'm not pigeonholing you because we've had this kind of sort of conversations before. I invited Cayden on through his roles on 18 Million Rising, but also back in May, I actually invited Cayden to write one of the most popular articles that ended up being on the site for Asian American Heritage Month, AAPI Heritage Month, and it was called "We Are All Cyborgs." And I invited Cayden to talk a little bit about digital activism through that column, and he wrote a paragraph that I thought was just phenomenal that I just want to share with you guys here about the sort of growing digital life that we have here between the real world and the digital world. He wrote, "The internet has played no small part in the moment we're in. More than ever, young people are connected to each other, having conversations about the things that matter to us, from pop music to police violence. We're realizing that there are more of us than there are of them, and that's an incredibly hopeful thing. We live in a time of rapid reinvention, and at a moment when the conversations we are having online, for better or for worse, are catching the attention of the mainstream." And I think that really sums up what the digital world and digital activism is like for us today. This idea that we're all connected and that we're all... I liked this idea of being cyborgs, and I wondered, I've seen that you've written other things with that in mind as well, so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you sort of came up with this idea or where you got this idea of the cyborg life from and what that really means to you.
Nice! We're jumping right into like the nerdy intellectual meat. This is great.
That's what this is all about, right?
Yeah, totally. So the like big open secret is that I have a couple past lives from before 18MR, and one of them is as a professional professor track academic.
Oh, really? I'd actually
yeah,
know that.
This is my secret past life. I did a Master of Fine Arts in Digital Media, and I was totally like fast tracking to professional academia, and then I was like, wait, I don't want this.
way. That's what I want to do. Don't burst my bubble. I want to be an academic.
Well, I went to graduate school right out of undergrad, and I had some ideas that maybe weren't the best ideas, and like I needed to find a solution to some solutions to some problems that I had. I thought the solution was academia, but it wasn't. It turns out academia also led me to H&MR. So long story short, that's a past life. But so in this past life, my work for my Master of Fine Arts was very much about, I guess, like gender play, digital space and digital bodies. And one of the sort of like touchstone theorists that I always find myself coming back to is Donna Haraway. And for those of you who don't know, Donna Haraway wrote this essay in the late 80s called A Cyborg Manifesto, which is this like really like sort of beautiful and poetic aspirational piece of theoretical writing that lays out, I guess, like a vision of what late capitalism is and the way in which we're interpolated into it, but at the same time, like how we can resist it. And she's really specifically interested in like sort of like what like political economy looks like in this sort of like post-industrialized, globalized economy, what the place of women is in the technological order, what colonialism looks like after like I guess like the like 20th century nation state. It's a lot of things. It's like all the things. And like if you haven't read it, the entire text of it is online, totally findable. It is for me sort of formational because like I came to it via, I guess, thinking about the way in which we play video games and like how we relate to one another via video games. And it also, like, the more, I guess, like, traditional classical continental theory I was reading, like Foucault and shit like that, the more I came to realize that, like, a lot of the things that Foucault is writing about in terms of biopolitics and understanding the way that the state controls the body, Haraway offers us a sort of, like, route out of that kind of biopolitical order through the, like, science fiction, but also maybe, like, science reality figure of the cyborg, right? Which is, like, the integrated human and machine. Haraway is also she's like an evolutionary biologist, so she's also interested in how the animal integrates as well. But she gestures vaguely in A Cyborg Manifesto about cyborg politics, and she's like, this is going to be a really fruitful area. Oh gosh, sorry, Kat. Speaking of...
and this was in like the 60s, 70s, you said? Was this, when was this?
This is like late 80s.
Late 80s. Okay, so, well, but that's still really interesting because the late 80s, the internet is basically not a thing, right? Because I feel, for me, not knowing that history and not being an MFA type person, I was like, it resonated with me because one of my favorite Asian American texts is a collection of essays called AsianAmerica.net, and it was written, I think, in the like late 90s, early 2000s or something like that, or collected then. And it was talking about identity formation in the digital age. And one of my favorite essays was actually, it also drew upon this idea of the cyborg identity. And having that essay being written in the late 80s and these essays being written, basically before the advent of Facebook or Twitter, I mean, I feel like this is just so ahead of its time because I think that the term cyborg really defines, in terms of identity politics, what all of us are today. We all live these dual lives or these hybrid lives between who we are in the real world and who we are online. And I think that every day, every year, that line is getting blurred such that we really are sort of hyphenated people with feet in both worlds, and our identity really can't be divorced from that,
Yeah, and that's part of why I've always found Haraway really compelling, and I've also found Haraway really compelling as a transgender person, as a multiracial person, talking about somebody who's like parent. One of my parents has been in my mom's family has been in the United States for generations, and my dad is an immigrant from China, and like sort of standing at this like really strange divide of like what the fuck am I even, And then the fact that there are these big global systems of like capitalism, of imperialism, that like make those migrations possible, right? And then also the fact that like technology is like an undeniable part of like the way in which I live my life, you know, and really the way in which we all live our lives. So they sort of have this like big bucket idea of technology. Like language is a technology, right? Like even if you never touch a laptop, to talk to other humans, we still use language, which is like something that we invented to like do complex tasks, which makes it technology. Clothing, you know, whatever, anything you cook with, it's all technology, you know.
Right.
And then perhaps more complexly, as a trans person, like having to rely on basically state-of-the-art medical technology in order to like live. Pretty major. So I think that there's that sort of like dual, I guess, and this is like what's awesome about Haraway, is that she treats the cyborg both as something that's literal and something that's metaphorical, and I think that we see that a lot, like in the way in which we relate to the internet, I guess.
But what I really like that you're drawing upon also, you know, relating it to the trans experience is the construction of identity, which I think is also afforded in the digital world. You know, I always talk about the digital world is particularly unique because you can basically create or recreate yourself. And I mean, obviously there's a certain level of, I feel like there's a certain level of technological ethics that are there now where most people don't completely try to be someone else. You know, through Facebook, it's hard to kind of do that. But you still have a chance to put the versions of yourself out there that you want to put out there. You can kind of be a different person. And the more that you want to take the identity becomes more fluid because you have a certain amount of control through the formation of your own digital self. And I wonder do you see that as well, or was that just a really crude way of putting that?
Actually, what's interesting about that is that the way in which a lot of our like current social media platforms operate, and the sort of like emphasis on who you are actually like in real life, is completely a construction of those platforms, right? And they're like, in the good old days of the internet, everybody was whoever they said they were, right? Like,
yeah, like I feel like back in the day, anybody could be anybody, right? Like you had no trust that the person you were speaking to was anything like they said that they would be, and I think that that's changed now because of, you know, Facebook or other social media platforms that have sort of tied you so that you put a picture, or so, you know, catfishing or whatever is less likely now, even though obviously it still happens because now we have a term for it.
But it's interesting because I feel like in some ways we've become more naive because of this sort of Facebook phenomenon, but like that Facebook phenomenon is also an attempt by people who are trying to make money, so like an attempt by capitalism to recapture like basically like what was this kind of lawless, crazy time in the internet. One of the things I like to point people to is this book called My Tiny Life by Julian DeBell. It's about one of the earliest moves, so multi-user dungeon object-oriented. So MUDs were originally developed to be like these role-playing environments, but then people made moves where like you could manipulate them, and like universities would host these things, people would fucks around with them. But My Tiny Life is about the specific Mu and the way in which the people who inhabited this Mu decided to self-govern. And then this sort of like cataclysm that happened around like hacking and sexual harassment. And it's like massively informative about like the way that people operate on the internet, and the fact that like the way that we design technology has a lot to do with the way that we inhabit internet space. It's a great book.
And I think that sort of ties us into what we want to talk a little bit about today, this idea of the digital life. And so when it comes to like social justice issues, the idea that that activists would try to find a way to translate activism to the digital world to sort of satisfy the parts of ourselves that are living these digital lives, it's just an intuitive idea. And so I feel like we've seen, even from the advent of the internet, we've seen social justice workers try to take these different strategies to go online and make activism digital. And I actually think that the Asian American community is really interesting because I think we were by virtue of our economic status, we had access to the internet in a way that other communities didn't necessarily have as much access to. And so we were sort of early pioneers in trying to use the digital tools and see what we could do and experiment with it. And so I feel like, you know, for our community at least, one of the things that was really formative for activism and the digital world was how we used message boards to coordinate the Abercrombie and Fitch protests back in the like 2000s or 2001s or something like that. Maybe 2003, I don't know. But anyways, it was really early on, before there was a lot of buzz over using the internet for this kind of activist stuff. And since that point, we've seen fits and starts of using digital tools to try and affect social justice. And so, you know, fast forward to 2013, 2014, you've got Facebook in the digital landscape, you've got Twitter in the digital landscape, you've got Reddit, Pinterest, blogs, message boards, sort of. And you've got a lot of different activists trying all of these different things to try and make activism work in the digital world. And one of the things that we've seen a lot of this year has been hashtag activism, which is, for those of you who are listening who have no idea what I'm talking about, it sort of is trying to use Twitter as an activist tool by taking advantage of the fluidity and frictionlessness of being able to create hashtags in order to create conversations. And so that sort of leads you to the question, is there a point to this? Is there a point to digital activism or hashtag activism, and how does it compare to real activism? So before I ask you, Cayden, I actually put this to Twitter, and I think that it was really interesting because I actually got answers across the board. I got the Honest Tibetan responded saying, yes, digital activism is real activism because for some people, staying digital is a way to protect one's own identity. Whereas Refresh Damon was a little bit more cautious. They said, I think it can absolutely be real activism, just like digital banking is real banking and digital theft is real theft. But there were some caveats that were placed that perhaps it's one of the many tools. Whereas William Bruce West, tweeting at William B. West, said, nope, digital activism is not real activism, it's slacktivism. It requires no real effort. And Kenzo Shibata said, when done planfully, yes, it is real activism. So what you can see across the board is that you've got, you know, some people saying, absolutely, this is the way of the future when it comes to social justice work, all the way over to someone else who says there is no way this is real activism because it's not real effort. So what do you think about the question that we had, and also why do you think that we got so many different answers really across the spectrum here?
Well, I think that part of it is because when you say things like digital activism, we're talking about a really large bucket.
Yeah.
I think
deliberately broad, by the way. It was deliberate.
A huge bucket, right? And I think Kenzo has written this great bit for Hack the Union about the work of digital organizing and the way that it relates to the actual door-to-door work of organizing a union. And Kenzo's great. During the Chicago Teachers Union, he was the CTU's social media coordinator, and I met him at Labor Notes a couple years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
And actually, he actually said that digital is one tool in the organizer's toolbox. It cannot replace traditional organizing, but it's something. But dismiss it at your own peril.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's interesting because the set of digital tools we have is like rapidly expanding. So and for me there are two ways that I think about the internet, right? There's the tool-based sort of idea that's like what do the tools do? What are they best used for? And how can I use them to my advantage? And then this is sort of like place-based thinking about the internet, which is like every social network on the internet is a place. And much like, you know, if you are organizing a union for a contract, or if you are organizing your neighborhood to get somebody elected to the city council, you need to go where your people are. So in a union, you go to the workplace. In your neighborhood, you go door to door, talk to your neighbors. In a similar way, like, the internet is now made up of many different internets. Like, it's not just one. So there, I think there's an important question that I don't see asked enough about constituency and like, who are your people? Your people are not everybody, obviously. Your people are not everywhere. And I think that a rookie mistake is assuming that digital activism works the same in all places and all times for all people.
And by different places, you mean that the same strategy for Twitter would work for Facebook, would work for Instagram, or would work in the different neighborhoods within Twitter.
Totally, yeah. I mean, the way that people use the same social network is even wildly different depending on like people's demographics. So, you know, again, this like comes back to a very like basic offline organizing principle is like know who your base is, know how to activate them, you know, like know where to find them, know what they like, know how to talk to them. So those
and
are
I actually, sorry, I just really want to jump in really quick before you run away from that idea about going to where people are. One of the things that, for me, convinces me that digital activism is a place that activists need to be thinking about, and I tend to be pretty much where Kenzo is the understanding that, you know, minority communities, you know, whether Asian American or other people of color, we're disproportionately, we're really highly connected. You know, Asian Americans are among the largest online consumers of all communities in general, and people who connect to the internet using mobile services or cell phones, those are disproportionately are very highly represented among African American communities. And so if you're trying to connect with people of color, the internet is really one of the great ways to do that, especially considering how for many communities of color, they're geographically stratified and difficult to organize, and already a numerical minority. So it's a way to get at our community. Like if you're looking at the Asian American community and you want to talk to young Asian Americans, rather than, you know, setting up a base in New Jersey and a base in California, you can try and get to them where they all are congregating, which is online.
Yeah, and especially with the Asian American community, like, you know, you could just organize California and New York, but you'd miss everybody in the Midwest.
Exactly, yeah.
Everybody in the South, which is like increasingly a stronghold for Asian Americans. Like the number of Asian Americans who live in states like North Carolina and Virginia and Georgia and Texas is like exploding over the past couple of years.
Exactly, and we tend to ignore them. And we also, even in just traditional activism, we have a hard time reaching young people. That's, you know, just a known issue with traditional door-to-door activism, just by structurally how we do things. It's hard to contact young people who tend to be on college campuses, who tend to be at schools, who tend to, you know, not really be spoken to when it comes to the tools we have available door-to-door. And so going online is basically going to where they are and talking to them in their language.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that, you know, that place argument, it's like, this also takes us back to Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, because one of the interesting things she says about technology is that, you know, once it's been adopted and once it's been sort of propagated through a society, you can't take it back. You know, we can't go back to a time before the internet, because the internet has irrevocably changed the way that we think and interact. And I mean, I think that sort of cognitive disparity is also really important, because like the sort of like assumptions of the way we relate to each other have shifted over the past 5 years dramatically, right? Especially for young people, especially for people who use the internet heavily. And so it's not a question of like, is this a useful tool? It's like, this is a tool that you must adapt to. And I found this like when I was in grad school, I taught as well, that like the way that my students thought was very deeply shaped by the internet. It helped that I like studied digital cultures pretty closely, so I can sort of like see how those things lined up and like talk to them about it. But it's interesting that like even for me, who is somebody who I feel like I grew up with the internet, like the difference between the way that I went to school when I was in college and the way that my students went to school is like actually pretty markedly different. We're only talking about a difference of like 5 to 7 years.
And I'm going to date myself and say that I also feel like I've grown up with the internet, and I think I may have, I don't know how old you are, Cayden, so, and I'm not going to ask, but I know that I grew up with the internet, and that I was online in 2000, 2001 with my old Netscape Navigator coding in HTML, thinking I was the bomb diggity. And, you know, watched the internet grow up around me. Yes, I had a GeoCities website. And so, like, I've watched it change over the last 12 years.
I had a
What'd you say?
GeoCities.
Did you have a GeoCities?
Oh, I had a whole like sub network of GeoCities pages. I was like writing.
Shut up.
Yeah, I was writing interactive fiction before I even knew there was a name for what I was doing.
Oh my god. Okay,
Yeah.
so then the question of the real dorky question, because I also had a network because they didn't give me very much. What was your neighborhood?
I was like in a couple of different neighborhoods.
Really?
I was writing like anime fan fiction, but I was also like
Sailor Moon fan site, Television City, GeoCities. That's what I was doing in 1998 2000.
Yeah, the good old days of the internet. I also on the first internet connection we had was AOL.
Yeah.
So and I spent a lot of time on the AOL feminism message board. So college students who thought I was a college student and taught me about feminism.
So
I was in middle school.
I was in high school, so anyways, so like, what were so I brought that up actually for a real point, not to just nostalgize about GeoCities, but so what was really interesting watching the internet grow up around me is like this idea of how connectivity shapes language. I think is really interesting because being someone who was in high school when the internet started and watched it grow around me, and then to look around in the last 3 or 4 years, I feel like noticed a shift in how people interact with each other in terms of tone, in terms of what we think is interaction, and especially in terms of language, and that's the one I really want to pick up on. And I've actually theorized that the popularity of Twitter has changed the way that we communicate with each other, such that now it's almost as if we fit what we're trying to say into 140 characters or less to make everything a little bit more tweetable. And I think that that's a good thing for activists, and I think it's a not so good thing for activists. And I wonder if, first of all, do you think that you agree that maybe Twitter has actually changed the way that we talk to each other? And maybe we can talk a little bit about how Twitter specifically structures the activism that we try to do.
Oh yeah, I mean Twitter is just such like it's like such a sort of central locus of a lot of work a lot of people are doing right now, and for a lot of reasons, right? And like part of it is like there's very low barriers to entry. It's pretty straightforward and easy to understand. It's not like Tumblr where you need to like learn how that thing even works. Like I know I
don't know how to tumble. Like my cousin was like, you should totally get a Tumblr. I'm like, I don't even know what the verb for Tumblr is. Like I know tweet is the verb for Twitter. I don't even know for Tumblr.
But Tumblr recently entered the top 10 most trafficked websites in the United States recently. Like it's number 8 on the list of top 10 websites. It's moving on up, and I love Tumblr. I'm totally into Tumblr. It's a great place. It's also a fucked up place.
To put it out there, I said this about Twitter like 2 years ago. I was like, I can't tweet. I don't know what this is.
Well, Tumblr is where the kids are. Like if you look at the demographics, like their sort of age range is like 14 to 25, and it skews Asian and Latino, which I thought was really interesting. But yeah, I often tell people that I think Twitter, for instance, has made me a much better writer because I've always struggled with being really verbose. And when you have only 140 characters to write in, you need to be like real smart about what words you use. But I also think that Twitter has a particular velocity and fosters certain kinds of connections that it's not as though I don't have a bunch of friends that I've made on Twitter who are fantastic friends. Who's like shout out to you guys, because you're the best. But I think that there is something about like speed and brevity of each touch that you have with another person that makes it, I guess, like not. Unless you maintain that relationship in different ways. I'm thinking specifically about like the way that Tina Vasquez uses Twitter. I love Tina Vasquez to death. We've only ever talked on Twitter, and we'll have like long conversations on Twitter, and it's great. But unless you sort of go out of your way to like have those relationships with people, like it can be a very not surface level in terms of like what you're talking about is shallow, but rather in terms of like how you know people is rather shallow. It's hard to get a sense for somebody on Twitter unless they're using it to give you a sense of them, right? I think that's largely
and I think that's an interesting thing about the internet, you know, even from its early nascency even to now, is that it at one time removes barriers for communication, but it leaves a couple barriers there structurally, you know, immutable in the interaction. So in Twitter, you're always behind your avatar. You're always stuck in 140 characters, which for me, someone who is extremely verbose as a writer, like I feel like the tweet is like a cage, and I'm always beating against that 140 character wall. Like I just wish I could have another 20 characters, you know, like so. I find Twitter extremely challenging. That being said, I have become something of a convert in seeing how it's like 2 years ago I was like, fuck Twitter, I hate Twitter, I don't understand this thing, it's for the kids, and you know, I was totally against it. And since that time, a lot of hashtags have happened. You know, not your Asian sidekick, and then yes, all women, and also, especially with the Ferguson hashtag, you know, I just sort of watched all these hashtags come up within Twitter, and each hashtag that came up and sort of swept the Twitterverse made me more of a convert as to the power of what Twitter could do, as long as you were conscious of what Twitter was capable of doing. So that's why I said I'm kind of like in Kenzo's camp, where it's Twitter is great as an activist tool, an organizing tool, as long as you are completely aware of what you want Twitter to be able to accomplish and the many things that Twitter can't accomplish. So for me, as sort of like a natural blogger, I hate Twitter for having conversations because I just can't stick an idea in 140 characters. I just don't have this capability of doing this. But when it comes to publicizing things, engaging young people, trying to bring them into conversations and point them to things where you can talk in larger than 140 character places, I think it's phenomenal. And with, you know, this latest hashtag, you know, Ferguson with, you know, hands up, don't shoot, and hashtag, you know, if they shot me, well, I forget what it was called, if they shot me or something. I don't remember what it was called, but, you know, hashtag Ferguson spawned maybe 5 or 6 other sub-hashtags, and that was where I was getting all of my news regarding the Michael Brown shooting. And
right. Well, what's interesting about the hashtag Ferguson is that there were over 1 million tweets sent before CNN covered that. And I think that speaks to, again, something that Twitter is really powerful for is, like, if you are somebody who has a news story to break and you can get that thing in front of, like, a couple of people who have, like, you know, 5 or 6 figure followerships, like, you can blow that up by yourself, basically. I think, you know, the caveat there, right, is that you do have to get it retweeted by somebody who has a big followership like that. Otherwise, like, only people in your circle will see it. And this is, like, I guess, a property of networks that have existed over time in general that's, like, really hard to design away, is that there will be super connectors. It's just how it is. That's especially true, I think, on Twitter, where, like, the number of people who follow you increases the likelihood of you being retweeted, which increases your reach. It certainly is true of Facebook, but because of, like, the algorithm that Facebook is fucking with semi-secretly. There are
not very secretly.
Yeah, there's some, like, caveats and like different things there.
So for listeners who don't know what we're talking about, we're sort of touching a little bit on the free internet idea and net neutrality concepts, but basically the notion is that you can have different social media platforms may or may not have different algorithms for filtering what you see, and there are many users who aren't aware that the Facebook timeline or the Facebook feed actually has a filtering algorithm in it right now that decides what important news stories that your friends are sharing you need to be seeing. And so, for example, if your friend gets married, that tends to go to everybody because Facebook knows you want to know if your friend got married. But if your Facebook friend shares something like a status or a news article, whatever the algorithm, however it works, is deciding who is going to see that. So it's not everybody shares it, and then everybody sees it. And that's not true for Twitter yet, which is to say that if somebody retweets a thing, everybody who is following that person will see that on their timeline.
Well, Twitter's natural filter is time, right? But like, if you're not online synchronously with somebody who's tweeting about something, it's really unlikely unless you follow like 10 people that you're even going to see it.
Right.
So I think that one of the things that is interesting about that is that like a lot. Remember when Weird Twitter was a thing?
What?
This Weird Twitter?
I have no idea what that is.
But people were making these bizarre accounts that tweeted like sort of like interesting poetic nonsense, some of which were automated, some of which were like manned by people, like horse ebooks, right? But like I think part of the reason that Twitter gave itself over to like those kinds of things was that like there's a lot of spontaneity on Twitter, right? Like the things that you see are not so premeditated, but like sometimes a friend's post from like 3 days ago shows up on my Facebook homepage, and I'm like, the fuck is this even?
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that those features point to things that are, I guess, both strengths and weaknesses of the platform. And that, like, the spontaneity of Twitter is awesome, but also, like, there's something really powerful and kind of exciting about being able to game the Facebook algorithm, which you can do. And actually, there's this slide deck that Adam Mordecai from Upworthy has online. If you Google the sweet science of virality, you can find it. But it's basically like everything that Upworthy has learned through like trial and error about how to make shit go viral on Facebook. So like, unlike Twitter, where like you have to get your thing in front of like the right super connectors at a certain time, it's quite possible to like get a gang of friends together who have like overlapping but different networks and like actually manipulate the Facebook algorithm to deliver your content to other people. Anyway, that's super technical, but
I'm like, I need that group of friends.
Yeah, right.
But what I was thinking is that on the flip side with Twitter, so Facebook relies on you and your social network, and it sort of bottles you into your social network. Whereas what Twitter does is with these hashtags, it allows you to circumvent the limitations of your own followers by hashtagging something and crossing your fingers and hoping that a super connector is monitoring the conversation at the very same time and thinks that your tweet is just freaking awesome and retweets it to their network. And that, I think, is basically the power of the hashtag, is that it can connect people who are not otherwise connected in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's why a lot of people have taken to Twitter, because, the sad fact of the matter is like we don't have a lot of news outlets anymore in the United States that do like truly timely, really hard-hitting reporting on things that are like really tough to talk about. Like, for instance, racism and police violence, right? So it seems to a certain extent really natural that that should happen. And like we've seen sort of models of this being effective. And probably everybody's favorite model to trot out, right, is the Arab Spring. That like reporting on that via Twitter not only informed the world about what was happening, but also like ignited like waves of protests across them. And I think that that's like that's a non-trivial example. And certainly I think maybe the best and deepest and perhaps one of the things that have the most like immediately obvious material consequences. Like I don't want to say that have like the longest or most real consequences, but like the most material consequences we can point to.
Yeah. I always have a little bit of an issue when we bring up Arab Spring, though, only because I feel like that was a use of Twitter that was very, very specific. Like I said, I'm kind of basically where Kenzo is, which is like Twitter is a tool that needs to be used consciously and used specifically for what it can do. And I sort of contrast that with, I think that, as much as we ask people whether or not they think it's real activism and you get answers across the board, I think you'll have different activists who use digital activism in different ways, and there are some people who think sort of digital activism is this panacea of, it can do everything. Mm-hmm. And I don't subscribe to that in one at all. So you've got the Arab Spring where people are using Twitter to connect by circumventing traditional modes of communication and coordinating their efforts. And for me, that was very similar to how the internet is able to connect people and coordinate real-life action. So you have this hybridization or integration of what's going on digitally with what's going on the streets, and they're able to synchronize with one another and build upon one another and make everything that much stronger, both digitally and on the street. And then if you compare that to something like #BringBackOurGirls, which, as far as I know, didn't have a lot of street-level integration or anything to connect it with. And so I consider, #BringBackOurGirls, something that was great at raising awareness about issues that were related to that hashtag, but perhaps might not have ever been capable of producing anything tangible because there was nothing to connect it to.
Right, and I think that that's like a really important point that a lot of people miss, and they're sort of like thought, and like the majority of think pieces I've ever read about #activism have missed this really important point, is that like there's not one way to use Twitter, right? Like there are a number of different ways in which it works, and like there's something qualitatively very different for me to like go to like a direct action where people are blocking a Google bus, live stream that and tweet while I'm live streaming, versus me sitting in my living room and like writing my manifesto on Twitter, which I have certainly done. Right? They're two very different contexts and two very different uses of the tool. In both situations, I might gain some followers because people might be looking at this and be like, oh, like I care about this, and it seems like, in the Google bus case, like I care about gentrification in the Bay Area, and clearly this person does too, and like goes to things, so I can learn about that. And like my personal political views case, it can be like, oh wow, I really agree with this person. I'm interested to hear what they have to say, or maybe I really don't, and I want to follow them and harass them. But whatever.
That seems to be, at least a fraction of the people who tweet me too.
Right.
I actually want to get into that, though. One of the things that I do think that Twitter, I wish we could have a rational conversation about this, but it never really seems to happen, is how Twitter, for all of its great ways of connecting people, can also connect people, because it's so frictionless, with some of the darkest, most horrific parts of humanity that you never wish you were ever connected to. Like the people who have trolled me on Twitter are 1,000 times worse than what I get on my blog, like 1,000 times. And they're capable of tweeting me at all hours of the day for no particular reason. And I wonder if part of the ability to connect across vast distances under this veil of anonymity, and know that you're getting directly at a person, especially if you're, a small fish like me, so I only have, X number of people who interact with me every day. I wonder if that facilitates extremely negative interactions between people. Like, we almost see a degradation of what is considered appropriate behavior between people. And at the risk of this turning into kind of tone policing almost, but like I want to be able to have a conversation about tone in a way that doesn't turn into tone policing so much as just talking about the medium and how it changes our interactions with one another.
Right. Well, I think that, and this is something that I think about a lot because, like, I'm somebody who designs and builds technology, right? And I do believe that it is possible to design technologies in a way that facilitate certain kinds of interaction, right? And that, like, I think that you're right to bring up this question about, like, if the frictionlessness of Twitter also creates, like, it's like when you have a pond or something and standing water is like, it's like beautiful and like fish live in it, but also like it's a breeding ground for mosquitoes.
Mm-hmm.
Can't.
But you need to talk about it, right? And what I really feel sad about is that when I try to bring that up, I feel like it gets misconstrued, but I think it's a really valid thing we should be thinking about when it comes to Twitter, because with all of the great connections you can make with people on these like large hashtags, you also can become a target for harassing behavior, and Twitter doesn't have a very good built-in tool for stopping that behavior. I mean, it has the block function, but I actually hate that because all you can do is tell that person that you don't want to hear it. but that person can still be talking about you, and now you have no idea that that person is talking about you.
The other thing about block on Twitter is it's even softer than that. It's like it only blocks like certain kinds of communication. Twitter has a very loose safety policy, and like there are some good folks at Twitter who are like trying to figure out how to like preserve certain aspects of the way the tool works, while also like keeping people from being like communicating people with death threats. But it doesn't like I think philosophically there's kind of a disconnect in Silicon Valley with like the importance of user safety and like the boots on the ground experience that users have being harassed, and then the seriousness with which that is addressed. And like when we're talking about harassment, like I'm talking about not just like some random person who hasn't changed their Twitter avatar things away from the default calling me like a mean nasty face, to like people like basically stalking and doxing women of color. That everything on this spectrum happens, and like clearly it's really important that the folks who are doing things that are actually endangering people, like doxing them, not have the forum and the tools to do that. I think that, like, harassment on the internet like takes like wildly variant forms. But that like a really weak policy like Twitter's, I can deal with blocking a couple of eggs a week, but if somebody's releasing my personal information, telling people about like my medical history as a trans person, and like basically making things really, really dangerous for me on the internet, like that's a whole different ballgame. Unfortunately, we're just like not in a place where Silicon Valley seems to be taking these issues terribly seriously in the way that they design their platforms.
And definitely, I think that part of the issue is as we're living these digital lives online, it does become easier for these harassing people to find information about you that, maybe we are becoming more naive, maybe it's just more impossible to not live your life digitally. But like, having a Facebook page, when I started blogging, I tried to blog anonymously. And part of the reason I never had a podcast, part of the reason I tried to do this was I was trying to protect my identity in real life from what I was saying online. I was trying to protect my family. I was trying to protect my partner. I was also trying to protect my future and my career. I just had no idea whether or not this was, saying things on the internet, whatever I was saying was going to be something that might come back to haunt me. And sort of outing as the blogger for Reappropriate happened sort of progressively over the years, and not necessarily by choice. It just sort of, every time, as the longer you're online, the more little bits and pieces of yourself get left behind, to the point where I was finding that people knew who I was. They knew my last name, and then pictures would come up that got tagged me, and then, my Facebook page suddenly got associated with me, and these were never things where I was like, I'm just going to put these two things together. It was like somehow living my digital life and living it maybe not as skillfully as other people would, it just sort of happened over time to the point where I kind of gave up. Like, I can't be anonymous anymore, so why bother, and let's make a podcast. My friend John Brockman, who is listening, actually wanted to bring up an interesting point, which is, we've been talking about how Twitter changes how we interact with one another, but he says, look at what political communication used to be and the various complaints people have made about new modes of communication, telegraph, the newspaper, etc. XKCD has a good collection of quotes. Communication has never been polite or kind, and every new communication has done nothing more than make that stuff obvious and open communication to more people. And I actually think that's a really important point. I don't, and maybe it's slightly different from what we're saying, because what John is saying is that, this bad behavior that we're seeing online isn't an invention of the internet. It's simply it's been facilitated by the internet to allow us to see it. And as we lose barriers of connection between one another, we just get exposed to more and more of the sad parts of humanity that make us really, really sad and lose faith. And I think to some extent that's true. It's not as if we invented bad behavior in the last 3 years. But on the other hand, back in the day when the telegraph was the thing, I don't think we were necessarily concerned that somebody that was thousands of miles from us was going to figure out who our wife or husband was and come and, you know, murder us in our sleep. Like, that person wasn't going to spread this information to a whole bunch of other people through the telegraph. So I think it's a genuine concern for us to be thinking about as we live these digital lives and as we put ourselves out there with our politicized social justice thoughts, what the ramifications of that might be. And that sort of naturally segues into the conversation we've been having all week online about the internet and social justice as it relates to personal lives and consequences, which is the Steven Saleta controversy. And are you familiar with that, Cayden?
Oh yeah, definitely. I've been paying quite close attention to it, and a really good pal of mine is UIUC alum as well. So,
do you want to give us a quick update? Because I actually have been following, but probably not as closely as other people.
I haven't read anything over the weekend. I basically spent my weekend not on the internet because now that I do the internet full time for work, I just don't.
I'm the same. Like, I unplug on the weekend. I'm like, I can't do this.
But basically, I think the most recent update is that Chancellor Wise, who is in charge of the UIUC campus, walked back her decision, but in this to de-hire Saleta, basically, but in like this really weird, like, sorry not sorry, kind of blaming the board of trustees statement.
So for listeners who aren't aware of what's going on, basically Steven Saleta was offered a position at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, I think, and he was going to join, I think, this semester, but then sent a series of tweets that I think were critical of Israel, and I think that was what it was, right? Critical of Israel, and related to the Gaza conflict. And the tweets were interpreted as anti-Semitic and inflammatory and what should not be said, I guess. And basically, the job offer was rescinded for Saleta sometime, I think, a week and a half to 2 weeks ago, all related to what Saleta said on Twitter. And so, you know, this is an example of someone who's using Twitter as a platform for his political views, as well as, you know, his First Amendment rights, having a you know, real life consequence that perhaps he did not intend. Perhaps he did.
It's also worth noting that, like, his views on Palestine are not irrelevant to his scholarly work, so this should have come as no surprise to everybody.
yeah, and that was actually one of the best articles I read. Was contemplating, you know, this is his work, this is his research. What he does is comparative studies between I think it was indigenous peoples around the world, and so he was hired on into the American Indian Studies Department, and so people were asking, well, why is he talking about Gaza? And actually much of his work recently has been comparing the plight of the Palestinian people in Gaza with other indigenous peoples around the world, including native peoples and their history here.
Yeah, well, and I think the thing that's really interesting about this case is, in some ways, it points up the way in which you know, sort of existing power structures are still preserved in the spaces that we often tout for being, like, really horizontal and really free, right? That, like, it's still the case that this, like, younger faculty member who supports, in, you know, frankly, in the United States, the unpopular opinion is unpoliced about the way that he advocates for oppressed people, right? And, like, there's this very clear way in which our online lives and our offline lives sort of move into each other, and it can be easy to forget, I think. Not that I'm saying that, like, Saleta is at all responsible for what happened to him. I don't think that's the case at all. In fact, like, I think it's amazing that, like, something like 9 academic units at UIUC have, like, passed a vote of no confidence resolution in the chancellor, and all of this stuff. Like, I think that's fantastic and, like, a victory for academic freedom and for speech. I think in general, the way that you counter speech that you don't like is with more speech. Like, generally, there are some very clear exceptions. Those are like violence, or things that are, like, overtly hate speech. But in general, as like an academic and somebody who really cares about like the way we use the internet and like the areas of our public discourse, I think that what you need to do in this case is like add more speed. It might be pedantic and boring to some people, but only the people who care will stick around. It's true of anything. But I think that this reaction points up the fact that we do live these super complex lives, and also that like people are watching you basically all the time. Just like
yeah, no, and that's the thing about Twitter that I find is also much of a challenge. When you try to do activism on Twitter, and if we move away from Twitter being used as an organizational tool, as it was used in Arab Spring, and try to use it more as a conversation tool, and that I think is actually what it was doing relative to #Ferguson, which for me was a major engagement point for Twitter. And I don't necessarily think it was really coordinating the street-level protests. I think it was starting conversations about race and police brutality, as well as simultaneously spreading the kind of news that the mainstream media was just completely incapable of covering properly. And or unwilling. Yeah, for sure. So, in the last couple of minutes of this particular podcast, I'd like to get at whether or not you think that Twitter can be a forum for conversation. One of my favorite pieces that Jeff Yang of Wall Street Journal Speakeasy column has ever written, and Jeff is, one of the fixtures of the Asian American online writer community. He wrote a piece several months back which coined this term weaponized hashtags, and it was talking about Not Your Asian Sidekick, but it's relevant to basically all Twitter conversations that are not organizational so much as awareness building. And, he talked about the wonderful things about Twitter, but he also talked about the limitations of Twitter when it comes to trying to start conversations where the point of the hashtag is the conversation, not something else. And I tend to actually agree with Jeff. Like, if we think that Twitter, you can use Twitter for different reasons, and one of the things that Twitter can do is awareness building or consciousness building, is Twitter really the best forum for doing that? And I would argue that maybe, but again, if you're conscious about it, if you think about the limitations. Like, on the one hand, I think Twitter hashtag conversations are bringing in people and forcing them to think about things that they've never thought about. And again, they're reaching people who are typically young and typically apolitical. So if we're having a conversation about police brutality, it's a great way to bring in people who maybe have never thought about racial profiling ever in their lives and are going to college for the first time this fall and are suddenly finding their Twitter timelines full of these ideas and hopefully getting them to think about them. But on the other hand, our hashtag conversations is it structurally a good place to have a complex conversation about identity politics? And as someone who's a verbose blogger, I would actually argue no, because in 140 characters, it's very hard to bring nuance into anything. And so, and also, every tweet that you send out is permanent and taken sort of as a standalone tweet, even though you might try to make it string a couple tweets together. It can be really hard to do that, and I think that we've seen a lot of people sort of get messed up with Twitter because, at least in part, they're not thinking about how each tweet is going to be taken individually and then retweeted out by itself, and then it loses all context if it was trying to be in like a larger manifesto. And so Jeff is starting to, scratch at the surface of these conversations about Twitter as a conversation tool. And you spend a lot of time on Twitter, probably more than I do, because I use it mostly for trying to publicize things that are happening on the blog and direct people to a place where I'm not stuck in 140 characters. So I wonder, what your thoughts are on whether or not nuance is a problem on Twitter, or if, Jeff is wrong on this, which he totally could be too.
Well, I think nuance is a problem everywhere.
You think what's a problem everywhere?
Nuance is a problem everywhere. On the internet, in my experience, there's never been a time that I have been a member of an online community where I have like never in that community seen somebody take something else somebody else said, intentionally or otherwise, completely out of context and like totally turn them into a bad guy. I've never been a part of an online community where this has not happened.
Mm.
Like that's been a mainstay since the late '90s. Like this ain't new. And I think
yeah. I mean, it's true. Like when we were, on forum boards and message boards, this happened. But this was happening with like reams of sentences, right? So like you had the chance to develop a big complex thought. And my issue with Twitter is that it's really hard to develop a big thought in 140 characters.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely a problem, and pointing back to my teaching days, that like teaching people to like formulate a like complex argument in a 5-page paper has suddenly become very challenging. I think the bigger problem with sort of this, I guess, this question that we're talking about is that it becomes really easy to isolate things that people have said, take them out of context for a brand new audience, put them in front of that brand new audience, and then turn that audience against people, right? Like, the bigger issue is, like, if I'm having a heated discussion with you on Twitter about something, it is very easy for me, or even a third party completely uninvolved in the conversation, to grab one of your tweets and be like, look at that Jen, she's so crazy,
Yeah, which happens all the time.
I'm sure it does. It happens to me all the time, too.
Yeah, like, and it's really frustrating because, when, again, I'm someone who's a natural blogger, so I'm used to the way that I think and I approach ideas is, by default, I'm going to write 2,000 words. And anybody who reads my site knows this about me, right? Like, I can't write anything shorter than that. So the idea of trying to have a conversation with someone where each sentence is supposed to be able to stand alone is a huge challenge for me. And I take my hat off to people who can do it. And I'm not saying that there's something wrong with that. I'm saying it's not a skill everyone has. And I think that one of the risks of Twitter is that this is sort of inherent and structural to the medium, that things will go out there, they will be permanent, and there's no context. You can't expect context.
Yeah, and I think that, especially in the Seletic case, we see that sort of coming up in terms of, like, when you just see his tweets, like, especially the like, his angriest tweets out of context in, like, an article in, like, the Chronicle or something, you're like, this dude's nuts.
Yeah.
And you think about his scholarship, like, his scholarly body of work, his activism, his body of work as an activist, and, like, the rest of his, like, Twitter oeuvre, right? Like, it completely changes, like, how you feel about what you're reading, right? And you also place it in historical time, not just personal time, right? And I think that, this is something that's one of the, I guess, for me, the interesting thing as an educator about our sort of time in technology and media is that as the barriers to entry in terms of, like, people writing their own material using Twitter have become lower and lower, the importance of media literacy has become higher and higher. And the problem is like, a lot of our, the people who are teaching media literacy are also not doing it in a way yet that is responsive to social media. We see a lot of people making, like, really stupid logical errors on the internet, or, like, misunderstanding a medium for what it is. And I think perhaps also, very frighteningly, a lot of, like, disorganizing, right? Like, people intentionally derailing the work of others. And it's something that, like, I hate seeing, and, like, some of it's super coordinated, right? Like the whole Gamergate thing, that, like, super intentional, like, 4chan community of people who are, like, trying to disorganize women in games, who are, like, really doing a bunch of really neat shit.
Right. And we can even go to Ferguson and we can talk about how Anonymous tried to, use their powers for good and, try to encourage the protests on the street, and we're trying to say, we're going to protect you from police brutality, and Ferguson police, we are watching you, which was initially heralded as a really great thing, but then those powers were turned to, less good when Anonymous, I think, part of the issue was they started publishing the wrong names and harassing people. And, 4chan also was doxing a lot of progressive feminists on Twitter, creating false accounts in order to try, a modern digital COINTELPRO, basically. to try and sow discontent. And only recently have we been able to identify some of these major accounts that 4chan trolls set up to basically harass feminists. And these accounts had been online for years, or at least months, and had become people that we thought of were pillars of the Twitter community. And then we find out that they were actually, a very complicated, coordinated troll attack. And that's the kind of thing that the internet can do, at least in part due to, I think, again, the inherent thing within the internet, which is this ability to create and shift identity. And one of the things that really bothers, again, I grew up with the internet, and I remember sort of my bright-eyed, bushy-tailed times when I thought the internet was going to be this great democracy tool for ideas. And I was really excited about blogging, which is why I'm a blogger, because I really thought, this was going to de-hierarchize ideas. Blog posts would be prompts, and then it was really the comment section that was important. And I keep comments open for that reason. I really actually think that the important part of a blog is the comment section, not what I write. And I really want them to be prompts for discussion so that people coming in can learn things and interact with people. And lately, the mantra on the internet is don't read the comment section. And I think that's terrible for what's going on the internet. And I think that has to do with how anonymity shields people and allows them to create bad behavior, to coordinate vicious attacks, and basically derail what I think was the point of the internet and how it could be used as a social justice tool. And all of the things that we could use the internet for also has inherent weaknesses related to how we are online. So you have these doxing attacks, you have troll attacks, you have people who are commenting anonymously and sharing your personal information and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely super complicated, and I think that probably the greatest risk to online activism now is this kind of disorganizing, just because it can be really hard to sort out what's going on. And also, sometimes it's not within our capacity to wade through this shit, either mentally and emotionally, or if we're actually being put in physical danger by stuff. But at the same time, I tend to agree with you that I think the thing that on the internet is that every so often I'll meet somebody new who's really amazing, and maybe a good example of this is during the SCA 5 non-debate in California, which was
what debate?
Proposed constitutional amendment that was about re-banning affirmative action in California, basically. We got an email at the general account on 18 Million Rising's general account from a woman whose son he was 14 at the time. I think he's 15 now. He's a freshman in high school. This is his sophomore year. No. He wrote this essay about why he, as an young Asian American, middle class Asian American man, thinks that affirmative action is really important. And it's shit like that I'm like, fuck yes, this is why we need the internet.
Yes. Oh my god. Okay, so we're talking about Jason Fong, who
I would not be following Jason Fong on Twitter. It's really
I am the biggest Jason Fong super fan, and Jason knows this, so this is why I can say this. And he, I followed him on Twitter as soon as I read that essay. Jason Fong is 14 years old, and he is abso-fucking-amazing. It's ridiculous. He is a better writer than I am. He is insightful and funny, and I am completely shocked that this person is 14 years old. Maybe 15 now, and I cannot wait for 15 years from now when Jason Fong runs for president, because I will be there, his campaign manager.
And and I think that it's one of these hard things where it's if the internet was not what it is, I don't think that Jason's mom wouldn't have sent him that essay, and we wouldn't know who he is. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And as it is and I've been saying this to people about disorganizing in general on the internet, is that the only way to combat disorganizing on the internet is to apply good practices of organizers who have been organizing offline for generations, which is know your people, know where they're at, know where they're coming from, speak their language, not in a like create some kind of weird in-group out-group dynamic, but like be literate about what you're reading and from whom, and like trust your gut about people who are like infiltrators. You know what I mean? Like, you you mentioned COINTELPRO, and it's like, the government has infiltrated online communities. Like there was a series of anonymous ops that were actually instigated by an FBI agent.
Really? I didn't know.
Yeah, you should check that out. Also check out Gabrielle Coleman's work on Anonymous, very informative. But like these things have happened and they continue to happen, and just as we as activists are adapting to new technologies and learning how to use them and like doing cool things but also fucking up sometimes and like all kinds of stuff, so too are the people who are trying to suppress dissent. Whether it's hate groups who want to shut down people who are organizing certain things, or the government that's worried that we're like all going to incite a revolution, or like I don't even know what they're scared of at this point. Like I really don't understand.
Well, so I think one of the things I really quickly want to pull out of what was a really fantastic insight was just this idea of trying to bridge those two gaps, which we sort of touched on already, but bridging the worlds of street organizing and street activism with digital activism, that we're really, rather than setting it up as two different things, which, I intentionally set up the question tonight as if real activism and digital activism were two separate things that could be compared. And I actually did that on purpose so that we would come to the end and say they are actually two halves of the same coin. So Shonda Rhimes, who is the creator of several big TV shows, including Scandal, was famously said in a convocation speech, hashtag is not helping. Hashtag yes all women, hashtag take back the night, hashtag not all men, hashtag bring back our girls, hashtag stop pretending hashtags are the same as doing something. Hashtags are very pretty on Twitter, and I love them. I will hashtag myself into next week, but a hashtag is not a movement. A hashtag does not change anything. It's a hashtag. It's you sitting on your bed, typing into your computer, and then going back to binge watching your favorite shows. Which really suggested that, what you're doing on Twitter is not connected to the real world. Yet, when you ask other people about why there's such disdain for hashtag activism or digital activism, you get people who offer much more nuance. So someone like Refresh Damon says, people are disdainful possibly because some believe that everything that happens on Twitter starts and ends with the hashtag. And some of those actions really might be, but also there's miscommunications on Twitter. And then Malcolm Shields, who tweets from @McDiesel1215, says, there's disdain because some people think being a hashtag activist isn't as productive as old school traditional activism, and that a hashtag doesn't make as much progress as opposed to going outside and being in the trenches and doing work with other organizations and other organizers. And what I think was really interesting is that, this is what people think, but Kenzo Shibata is saying digital activism is just one tool in the organizer's toolbox, and that's where I am. It's something that can be used and harnessed, kind of like what John Brockman is saying, is just a new form of technology. But it's not the panacea. It's just got to be something that that activists have to be aware of what its strengths and its weaknesses are, and to use it wisely for a specific goal, just like organizers do on the streets. Like, we don't just have a goal and then we just go out and knock on doors willy-nilly with no idea of what we're doing and why we're doing it. We really, set a goal and set a mission, and then pick the right tool in our toolbox to accomplish that goal. And I think that when we approach digital activism like it's just another tool, rather than something that will revolutionize the entire field of organizing, that's where the solution is, where we, tailor our questions for the tools, and we tailor what our goals are based on what we have available to us. And I think that's really the solution, that, whether or not digital activism is real activism, digital activism is part of real activism. It does not substitute for real activism.
Totally, and I think that a lot of people miss that, and I think Kenzo raises this in his piece for Hack the Union, that like the work that people do online, it's still real work, right? And I think that I'm really sad that we don't have time to talk about this, because there's this, this is a really interesting argument about like the feminization of labor, emotional labor, and like what God, I forget who the theorist is who invented the term immaterial labor, sort of the like emotional and digital labor of like not making stuff but making services, and how that's like a super like the way that our economy is structured like very much feminizes those kinds of work, and the fact that like Black Twitter, when we talk about Black Twitter, we're really talking about Black women on Twitter, right? Like, let's be real, right? Like, like a lot of this online digital work is the like meat of it, the real meat of it, is like done by women. And I think that I think that it's not an irrelevant point to bring this up because of the fact that like, and I think this is kind of in some way Kenzo's edging at this, that like, we devalue that work in a very profound and systemic way, right? Part of
and you're arguing that the devaluing comes at least in part through the disdain that we have for the decision or the choice to use digital landscapes as our world where we're going to situate our activism.
Absolutely. I mean, I absolutely think there's like a very clear gendering of the kind of work, and like as somebody who's existed in a lot of radical spaces offline, finding that a lot of like offline like meat space organizing like of the radical variety is very alienating to like women, to queer people, to disabled people, and then coming to the internet and being like, oh, this is the work that I can invest myself in emotionally and do and like measure my impact. It's really huge. Like it's very major for somebody who is like, you know, I am far too anxious to do most direct action. Like, nervous wreck.
Well, I think that it, you know, just as we say that digital activism is, you know, picking, the activist needs to pick the right tool for the question, I think that the activist also can choose to be online if that's what suits their personality, right? Like, you know, I started off the conversation with the tweet from the Honest Tibetan saying, because for some, staying digital is a way to protect your identity. And it's very true that for some people, you know, street organizing, street protesting is simply not possible for, you know, reasons having to do with chronic illness or being a single mother working full-time, or needing to be anonymous for reasons, you know, to protect one's own identity.
Like if you live in Montana, you're not going to be able to make it to the Oakland port blockade, you know? Like,
yeah, that too. Like, right? Like, if you want to, you know, I'm supporting Ferguson. I don't live anywhere near Ferguson, right? But I want to be able to support. The only way I can do that is to be online, because I wanted to be part of a vigil for one of the National Moment of Silence things, and there wasn't one anywhere near me in Connecticut. So the only way I could participate in that was online.
Yeah, and you know, I think that this, like, ultimately, I think the lesson here is that, like, there are just different tools for different purposes, but I think that sometimes when people say that, I'm like, but there's this really important observation, is that the tool also changes us, right? And that I think people who, even some people who say, well, like, digital tools are just another set of tools, that maybe that gets left out of that argument is that digital tools are an extremely new set of tools. They're an extremely new set of tools that are being controlled by people who do not have our best interests in mind, who are designing these platforms to do particular things, and many of those things, they're not thinking about the activists, right? They're thinking about they're perhaps only thinking about the activists in terms of, like, how are they going to generate traffic to make us more money, right, in the case of Twitter.
Right.
And I think that the tools argument also, even that, I would say that we need to, like, balance that with a recognition that, like, the tools are owned by somebody, and, like,
right.
that also has
implicit in what we're doing is we are making money for the people who own Twitter and the people who own Facebook. Like, Mark Zuckerberg makes money when we sign up for, and when we check our Facebook. Every time we do that, we're making money for Mark Zuckerberg.
And also, I sort of agree with this kind of maxim that if it's free, then you are the product. Yeah.
Which is totally true.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's in some ways, like, Twitter and Facebook are about this, like, the ultimate logical end of, like, sort of the recapture of subversion of capitalism, right? Is, like, they're literally figuring out how best to, like, identify us as activists as a demographic market. And I'm like, I don't even know what to do about that. Like, I got nothing. I mean, I got something, but we don't have time for it.
Well, I'm going to actually close out the podcast with this crazy assertion that, I wanted to write a podcast or write a blog post on this, and I just haven't gotten down to doing it yet. This year there was a lot of conversation on feminist Twitter and about the decolonialization of Twitter and how it could be a space where it could change our hierarchies of thought and change the hierarchies of how we interact with one another. And while I think it's an interesting argument, what I think was lost in that argument was actually blogging. Because I think the one thing that Twitter #activists have yet to fully grapple with is exactly that point that you brought up, which is that Twitter is owned by the people who own Twitter, and you are the product. So at the same time that you're radically changing the way that people interact with one another and creating new neighborhoods and creating new ways of interacting that are decolonial, you are simultaneously reinforcing capitalism. Whereas I would actually argue that if you want to create a fully decolonial space, the way to do that is actually through independent creating the independent blog, because there you are the master of the space from start to finish. You can create it in any way that you want to, and you can create it in a completely radical way that completely subverts the way that people communicate with one another if you so choose. Everything that you do is open source. You can actually create a server in your basement that will host your blog, so you needn't go through any major corporations and contribute to gentrification or anything like that. The only interaction that you have to have with any of the powers that be would be the person with whom you would register your domain. Everything else, you can do it by yourself, and you can do it open source, and you can program it and create a space that is completely, radically different from anything anyone has ever seen. And you can put it out there largely for free, or you can try and figure out revenue-generating ways for the site to be self-sustaining, but in a way that doesn't make you the product, and it doesn't make your readers the product either. And so I would actually argue that I think bloggers, possibly because we showed up a long time before people started talking about these kinds of ideas, sort of get the short end of the stick when it comes to the conversation about how online conversations can be radical.
Yeah, I think that's totally true, and like that's why also I like point people back to My Tiny Life as well, because we're talking about some like random thing that some like nerdy kids set up on their a server somewhere, and that like a bunch of people ended up just using and figured out a way to self-govern. Like that's actually crazy radical, right? Like
yeah.
System for this thing that they made, like
right, and like what I find really surprising is we'll talk about Twitter, but we will never point out that WordPress is a completely open source blogging platform, and you download a package for free, and it's supported for free, and you could just completely hack it to bits and make it whatever you want. Like if you decided to do something that made it so that you couldn't, I don't know, the blog posts were teeny tiny and they looked exactly like comments so that you didn't create a hierarchy of ideas or hierarchy of communication, you could totally do that. So I just wish that we would have more conversations about blogging. But since we are out of time, and this is a much longer idea than the 2 minutes that I gave it because I wanted to write 8,000 words on this idea. What it sounds to me like, Cayden, is we actually need to have a sequel on this conversation.
Yeah, maybe we should just have a show about like Cayden and Jen talk about technology.
Well, I would love to do that. Like seriously, like I have so many ideas about this, and we got like this much teeny tiny bits of what I really wanted to talk about today. And like I said, I didn't even really structure tonight's conversation unlike all of the other ones because I figured we would just talk and talk and talk and talk, and we're already over time, so I kind of need to pull the plug now. So unless you want to have anything else to say, I think I'm just going to organize another episode on this. If you're okay with that, Cayden.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to, talk about these ideas with me, I mean, my Twitter handle is just my first name.
At Cayden, which is easy to remember.
I snapped that one up like way back in, I think it was like I registered early 2007, so like not like matter of months after Twitter launched.
Wow, that's exciting. I just am lucky because apparently nobody blogs under Reappropriate, so it's always free under everything. So, um, so if there's nothing else, I'm just going to wrap us up. And I want to thank you, Cayden, for stopping by and chatting with us on this. And I definitely think, like I said, I had an entire page full of notes, and we didn't really get at them. So I'd really love to tackle a little bit more this idea of how specifically the feminizing aspect that we brought up right near the end. So, so listeners, if you're listening and you thought this was a really great conversation, I hope you will join us later when I'm able to schedule Cayden for a sort of second half of this conversation where we can get into this a little bit more and maybe get even more into the hashtag conversation and the idea of the weaponized hashtag, because we really didn't even get to that until right at the very end.
Yeah.
And if there's nothing, do you want to say anything else, Cayden?
No, not really. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I want to thank Cayden for showing up, and definitely go follow Cayden on Twitter at Cayden, and check out 18 Million Rising, which is 18millionrising.org, for just a completely radical, revolutionary way of using the internet for social justice. And finally, I want to thank all of the viewers who live streamed this podcast for the much longer than an hour that it went. Right now there's 4 of you guys online, and I really want to thank you for sticking through the whole thing. And finally, I just want to give a quick shout out for the next episode of Reappropriate the podcast. We are scheduled hopefully to record in 2 weeks. I'm still waiting on a final confirmation from my guests, but I'm hoping to have 2 guests on, and we will be tackling the hot button topic of the Asian American blogosphere that's been a major issue for over a decade, which is the issue of Asian American interracial dating. So please join me in 2 weeks when we have that conversation. If you are listening and hope to listen again for some reason, you can stream this podcast tomorrow on YouTube or download it through the iTunes store. Thanks very much, and I'll see you guys in 2 weeks.